This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and we are here to help take your leadership to the next level. Richard, it's good to see you.
It's always good to see you as well, Sam.
All right. Well, you have traveled widely, and because of your position, you see a lot of great things. You see God moving in many places, but also because of your position, you see a lot of not so great things.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to look around you, the things you know personally, but also just things in general, the state of the country, the state of the church at large, or what have you. It's quite easy to look at things and say, I'm just going to be negative, or I'm going to be cynical. Nobody is righteous. You can
except me.
I was going to say you can echo the words of Elijah and say, "It's only me.
I alone am left."
I alone. Yeah, and you can even make money doing that. You could. There's a great cottage industry in being a complainer, in being a cynic, in sort of selling outrage, if you will. It's not hard to find those outlets. So how, in your position, because you get to see the good and the bad, how do you remain positive, and how do you keep from letting that cynicism infiltrate your heart?
Well, I thought maybe today, Sam, just in that vein, that I would talk about quarantining your criticism. How do you keep it from spreading? And through your own heart and life, and as well as to others. I think we all can see things that we disagree with, and that's not hard to do. Just open your eyes. But sometimes criticism, negativity is a poison, and once you let it in, it begins to take over more and more of the space in your life, your thoughts, your mind, your heart. And it could become a dangerous thing. And I am just regularly reminded of that. I was talking with the pastor recently, and he was just telling me that he had someone in his church. It was a lay person, but he took it upon himself to weekly critique everything that he disagreed with in his church. Now, he goes to this church, but every Sunday afternoon, Monday morning, he would post everything that he thought was not done right in the service that weekend. And of course, it might raise a question for you or me. Why do you keep going to a church that you put under withering critique every weekend? If it's that bad, why don't you move on? But he felt that was his role, was to let.
Is that his calling?
I know all of you people had a great encounter with God on Sunday. I know the altar was filled with people responding to a word from God, but you shouldn't have done that, because
but let me be clear.
That was a poor sermon. It was weak in some of its theological points. It was not delivered well. And 3 out of the 4 songs we sang are theologically inaccurate.
Technically speaking, that's not what Paul meant.
And so this pastor was saying, what do you do with someone that every solitary week he sees more negative than he sees positive in his church, in his pastor? And as I talked with this pastor, we kind of agreed these kind of people need help. I mean, well, on the one hand, I think they need to be confronted. And at a certain point, when week after week you're publicly critiquing your church, you really, for your own sake, need to move on and find a church that you don't feel so critical toward. If all you can see are the negatives.
Richard, all the churches in my area
this
would benefit from my critique.
That's right. Just think of all the wisdom I am sharing. And, there are some people, I think, that truly it is a prideful thing. And they do this because they really have the attitude, I know everybody else my church was blessed last weekend. But had they only been as smart as me and seen what I saw and known the Bible as well as I do, they would have been appalled. Rather than having a fresh encounter with God, they would have been indignant at what we were being exposed to. And so there are some people like that, and I'm unfortunately coming across more and more cases like that, where you can pretty well, if you see someone has just put a new social media post out, before you ever actually read it, you pretty well can anticipate it's going to be some more venting about what they are upset about and what they disagree with.
Yeah.
And so several things to say about that. One is, number one, God doesn't call us to be naive, but at the same time, you don't have to have Einstein's IQ to be able to see that there are things that are wrong, that are things that are not as good as they should be. It's not a sign of intelligence when you find something that's wrong. All you got to do is be able to open your eyes, and you're going to see that. So, but God doesn't tell you to be naive and just assume everything. You're not called to be a Pollyanna where everything is good and wonderful. We both know that there are problems, and that's just a given. But the second thing is, the Bible also says, "Judge not." And I know some people that will say that means that you should never speak out. You should never disagree with what's being done. You should never point out the negative, and I'm not sure that that's really what it means. I think what it means to judge not is don't act as a judge that issues a sentence that condemns someone, that says off with your head, put them in jail, let them be hanged. You're not passing a final sentence on people and condemning them to a lifetime of banishment or whatever else. I think it doesn't say discern not. It says judge not. And so I think there is room to discern. And for instance, and we've talked about this before, I'm not always a fan of every contemporary song that comes out. There are some that I think contains some very weak theology and some things that are just downright biblically false. And when I see those words, I don't have to just love it anyway. I mean, I can notice things that don't line up with Scripture. I think that's perfectly fine. But do you let that become an issue in your life where every song service in the church, every portion of the service where they're singing, you become miserable and you immediately begin angrily scanning all the lyrics to find the heresy hidden there? And then you rush home and post on Facebook or something how bad it was that your church sang 3 heretical songs on Sunday. There's a difference between being discerning and then just becoming a very critical person. And again, that doesn't mean that you never speak out or notice it, but be careful when all of a sudden you've been consumed by your criticism. And I think when you immerse yourself, it's kind of like marinating yourself in criticism. When that becomes your world, when that becomes the air that you breathe, then inevitably it's going to affect your heart. Yeah, it's going to affect your viewpoint. Once you begin becoming a critical person, you tend to find what you're looking for. And so if you now are on the rampage, and I've literally known people like this in churches, that, I mean, as soon as they walk in the door, as soon as they see the order of service, they're already just on it. The moment that a report comes out in their denomination, they're scanning the pages, just looking, not for the good stuff, not looking for what God is doing, not looking for what is done well, but skipping right past all of that. And now their whole viewpoint is just looking for the negative. And you immerse yourself in what's wrong, what's negative.
Now, I would think a lot of our listeners probably aren't that person, and I would hope not. Hope not. But I would imagine there's a fair number that attend church. They love their church. They're involved, and they do see things that either rub them the wrong way or feel like is just not the best way to do something.
Yeah.
How should what should they do, or if anything, to either address it with the church, with the leadership, keep it all inside and hope it stops being that way? What is a healthy way to address maybe issues that you feel like are legitimate, and not just, hey, I don't like that song. It's, hey, I disagree with the way that this is being done. What are some sincere ways for people who are sincerely take issue with something a church does?
Well, there's lots of things I think you can do, and I think one is just begin with yourself and audit your words. And I find this even with myself. And again, we began by kind of pointing out a pretty negative person, an example where you're way onto the one side of the scale. And I mentioned that just because I've just recently heard of some people like that, and I've known some people like that. So I know they exist, and that's not hypothetical.
Right.
And all you have to do is watch social media very long, and you'll encounter those people that everything they say is almost arrogantly putting down others and condemning them. But you have to begin with yourself, and I've noticed this even with myself at times where you need to audit the words coming out of your mouth. And just think about the last several lunch dates you've had with people, or coffees you've had with people, conversations you've had with people, and just ask yourself, what was I talking about? And you might discover, actually I mentioned 3 different people to my friend over coffee, and then I pointed out what I disagreed with all 3 of them. Mm-hmm. Or I mentioned a couple of churches or ministries, and I made a beeline for the one thing that I think they're doing wrong. But I didn't mention the 3 or 4 things that they're doing well. And if you find yourself where a person I remember one time a friend of mine was kind of shaken because he had coffee with a friend, and he came away and he said, I just felt burdened down, because he said that my friend mentioned about 24 different common acquaintances that we both had, and all 24 of them, he then told me what was wrong with them, without exception. I mean, it wasn't like this person is great, this person's bad. It was they mentioned 24 people, and they were all bad. And if you suddenly get to a place where there's something wrong with everybody, then that probably tells you, no, there's something wrong with you. Mm-hmm. That your eyes have become so darkened that everything you see is dark now. And so take an audit of yourself and your words, and just say, have I become a critical person that I'm just, my eyes are immediately zeroing in on the negative? And I think what a lot of people don't realize, we often think that we're being very righteous because we see what's wrong all the time. But the actual fact is we're becoming very unchristlike. I don't think people have any idea how unattractive it is when every time someone comes around them, they're just subjected to a spewing out of criticism of others. You can't imagine Jesus doing. Now, Jesus would call out things that were sinful, but he also blessed people. He spoke truth. He built people up. He forgave people. He showed grace to people. He healed people, set people free. And it wasn't just woe is you all the time from Jesus. There was a lot of positive, mostly positive stuff that came out of his mouth. And so I want to just always say, am I not just pointing out what's negative, but am I also celebrating what's good? And again, like we said, you don't have to be naive. There are problems, but take an audit and say, but am I being like Jesus right now? And sometimes people become critical because they're insecure. And I've known people that they felt insecure, and so the way that they felt better about themselves was by putting other people down. And it's not even really a theological issue. It's not that truly this is just a matter of biblical principles that are being violated. It is that every time I find fault with someone else, then I feel better about myself. And so if that's the case, then again, you need to say, okay, wait a minute, maybe this isn't really an issue about my pastor. Maybe this is an issue about me. And one of the reasons you don't want to just go down this path of becoming a negative person is because it's hard on your friends, it's hard on your family, it's hard on your spouse. I've known some people over the years that were the self-appointed critics of their church or their pastor, and then you watch their poor family. You just thought to yourself, what's it like being a kid in this family who goes home every day after church and listens to their parent pontificate on everything that their church did wrong that day? I mean, can you imagine the likelihood of that child growing up to being an adult and loving the church, loving God's people? Or what are the odds of them either being completely turned off at the church because all they ever heard is what was wrong with the church, or them becoming just like their parent and becoming a negative critic as well? And so I think for myself, I've had to guard my own heart sometimes to say, well, there's no question that I know of some negative things, but is that what I want to talk about around my family all the time?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's on my mind. I mean, I come home and I've been exposed to some pretty bad stuff that people have done and that are disappointing. And I know even just for my wife, Lisa, that if I do start talking very much about that, she'll make me stop. She doesn't want to hear about all that.
Yeah.
And which is good. It sort of puts a check for me to say, well, my family doesn't need me spewing about what's wrong with everyone else. And then again, I think for me, I've had to learn that simply being a critic doesn't change anything. And I think there's a lot of us that just need to be reminded of that.
Yeah.
Simply criticizing something doesn't make it better. And I've had to say to myself, so, Lord, if this is wrong, is there any way I can contribute to make this better? Can I address the problem? Maybe you look at your church and say, I just don't know that we're all that friendly. People visit our church and no one talks to them. Well, maybe you need to sign up to be a greeter. Maybe you don't even have greeters in your church and you just become a self-appointed greeter. Maybe you just start standing at the door with a big smile on your face and you personally welcome every visitor, every person who walks in the door, and saying, I could either just be critical of my unfriendly church, or I could take my friendliness to another level. I could position myself somewhere where people start to get a positive experience because I welcomed them when they walked in the door. And there's just lots of ways. You complain because church doesn't do anything in terms of prayer, and God says, well, why don't you put out the word that you're going to be meeting at the church on Friday mornings at 6 to pray with anyone who wants to pray for the church. And instead of simply sitting in your judgment seat critiquing the church, at least now there's something positive going on, and perhaps you become leaven, and maybe there's others who have a burden as well. But if you held yourself accountable to say, I will not criticize anything that I'm not at least doing what I can to address and make it better, then maybe you've lost the right to keep on being critical. And so for me, again, I've felt like, well, that's a good place of accountability. I'm not contributing anything in that area myself, but I'm criticizing it all the time.
Yeah.
And I think that's just a bad formula. Then you just tend to become very negative because you never look for a positive response. You just embrace the negativity.
Yeah. Well, let's take a break there, and we'll wrap up when we come back.
I'm very excited about the online class that BMI is offering, When God Speaks. This is the first book I ever wrote with my father, and perhaps one of the most important issues you'll ever address. How do you know when God is speaking to you? God speaks in many different ways, and God always has something life-changing, something crucial that He wants to communicate with you. You can't afford to miss what God has to say to you. Sometimes he may speak out loud, but often he speaks in numerous other ways as well. And you need to be alert to the numerous ways God may be wanting to communicate his will with you. This is a 6-week course in which we'll look at all the major issues related to God speaking to his people. It's full of videos and studies that you can do, and I know it will bless your life as you look very carefully at the various ways God may be wanting to communicate with you in these very important days in which we live today.
Well, I've heard of the negativity bias that we all have, and that's what's kept us alive when we were, hunter-gatherers. And people can say 10 nice things about you and one negative thing about you, and you won't remember the 10 nice things. You'll remember the one bad thing somebody said about you. And so I think there's also this innateness in us that tends towards the negative, and that's another reason that we need to be on guard against it. But just in our time left today, what are some other ways that we can guard against that?
Well, I think it's good just to know as well, and I know some people that truly feel that their calling is to be the voice of critique for everything that's wrong, and it can seem very well, sometimes it just seems holier than thou. No one else seems to be concerned about this, but I can tell there's a problem here. I can see a potential danger here.
I just have insight.
Yeah, and I'm just smarter than everybody else, and everyone else is just dumb as an ox and can't figure out that there's danger lurking here. But I notice it. But I just think for a lot of people, they need to also ask themselves, and how does this come across to unbelievers, maybe people who aren't Christians yet, when they hear me just constantly bad-mouthing my pastor, or bad-mouthing the church leadership or my denomination, and unbelievers listen to that. I'm not saying you never tell the truth, but just understand how other people perceive that. Whether it's your own family, whether it's an unbeliever, a visitor in your church, just a colleague at work, when all you do is critique, what do people come away with? Do they think more highly of your Jesus because you just pointed out 10 things that are wrong? Do they say, wow, I want to know that person's Jesus because he's obviously transformed that person's life? Or do they even, because I think sometimes even non-believers can be appalled at how negative Christians can be, and how critical we can be. And I don't know that is helping our cause any. Yeah,
I don't think people see your negativity and criticism and think, oh, wow, like what a transformed person, and tell me more about your Jesus.
Yeah. And, another thing I found, too, that there are those that are constantly, they love to go to discussion pages and just chew up what people are doing and this preacher and what all the things that are wrong with his ministry, but I often find that people that do that tend to be very heady. It's very academic. It's very cognitive. This I know he said this, and I know technically that might be true, but I could see where this could be taken in the wrong way. This could be misunderstood, and I know that there are verses that talk about this in the Bible, but I question that, and it's just very, very heady. Or there was this one phrase that was sung in this chorus today that I disagree with. The rest of it was all fine, and people were actually in tears and had their hands raised and were having a great worship experience. But I cannot be in any way satisfied if there's even one word that I think is not theologically sound. And what you find is they just don't have a lot of heart. And is it possible for you to actually still encounter God with a poorly written chorus, or maybe a poorly preached sermon? But could God still speak through His word to your heart? If you came with a heart that was open to encounter God, could God still use maybe a lukewarm kind of worship service, and you still have an encounter with God? But what happens is it's all in our head, and we become these very critical, self-righteous people pointing out all the shortcomings, but it's as if we've lost our heart. And there's no feeling toward God. Some self-appointed criticizers. Sometimes you just think, do they even have a heart anymore? I had an experience not long ago where the Lord. I was speaking a service, and God really moved quite powerfully. And there was an altar call, and the whole front was just filled with people responding. And there were even those that afterward shared before the whole church that they had done wrong, and that God had convicted them, that they needed to change what they were doing. And it was a very powerful time. In fact, afterward, the pastor of the church was quite moved and just said, wow, the Lord really visited today, and I've really been encouraged that our people are wanting to respond to the Lord, and so on. It was a beautiful day. But then afterward, there was someone that apparently found fault with that. I'm not quite sure all the reason why, but they just felt like the sermon was not preached in the most biblical way, I suppose. And it's like, well, I'm sure it could have been preached better. Certainly sermons I preach, I know could be done better. But it was hard to argue with the fact, but the altar was filled with people responding to what they heard God say to them that day. How could you walk away and say, wow, that was a terrible service? I know that a third of the people in the auditorium were at the front on their knees responding in prayer at the end of the service, but still, that's completely illegitimate, because that person did not follow the formula that I would have used if I were preaching that. And so you start to think, is there any heart? Because there's times where I've thought to myself, if I were doing that, I wouldn't have done it that way. I wouldn't have said it that way. But hey, 6 people came forward and to be baptized. Someone got saved today. A couple went up there and prayed that God would heal their marriage today. Hey, God, at the end of the day, sometimes you want to celebrate the fruit that was achieved that day, regardless of how it was done. I mean, can God strike a mighty blow with a crooked stick? He can, and there's a lot of crooked sticks. And so I think going along with that is just showing grace. I'm not saying that you always tolerate blatant heresy, but oftentimes it's really more a matter of emphasis. And I've had people say that to me. They'll say, well, I know the Bible says that, but I'm a little uncomfortable, or I wouldn't have probably emphasized that so much, or I don't know if that's the main point of that text that you highlighted. Well, okay, we can squabble over this approach or that approach, but do you have any grace to say? But today, as I was preaching and seeking God's guidance and what I should bring out for this congregation and what it needed, I just felt led to emphasize that. Now, if you were preaching that sermon, you would have maybe emphasized something else. But can you show me some grace and trust that I was seeking God's guidance and I was trying to preach to the best of my ability? Might not be as good as your ability, but can you show me some grace that since I was asked to speak today, I did what I felt that God wanted me to do. Mm-hmm. And there are times where I just have to show grace and say, well, this young leader, maybe he's a song leader, and very enthusiastic, very sincere, has worked hard, prepared hard. I don't know that I necessarily agree or like everything that they did, but you know what? They're serving God with all their heart. And I'm just going to show them some grace and realize I need grace shown toward me too, because I don't do everything perfectly either. So I don't want people to be always graceless toward me when I fall short. And that means I've got to show grace to other people.
Yeah, well, and I think so much of this issue comes back to just it's problems that you have. It's a person like, I wouldn't have done it that way, or this is it. But when you really look at it, it's like this is a likely, I don't know what the percentage is, but maybe it's 70-80% of the time, it's just it's a preference that you have, or it's it's an issue that you have. This is not necessarily, an issue on the face of it. It's how you perceive it.
Right.
And much of the time, I think if you just have that grace and maybe don't act on those feelings that you have or the way something strikes you, and show that grace, I think that will go a long way.
Yeah. And I think this may be the last thing just to say in that is make sure that what you're criticizing, what you're saying, is not being driven by pride. If it's coming out of genuine humility, you're probably much safer. But you hear a lot of critiquing these days that just sounds very, very prideful, very smug, very self-righteous, where we're putting down others, and by doing that, it's in some way, in a morbid kind of way, exalting us somehow. And it just fosters pride. It just says, I'm smarter than you. You're dumb, I'm smart. You're naive, I'm insightful. And you go away, and it just reeks of pride. And so I found if I'm truly entering into a worship service, I'm going to work with a humble spirit that realizes I'm a servant of God. I'm saved by grace. I've got lots of sins and shortcomings that I need the grace of God for in my own life. Again, it doesn't mean you're naive, but it means that you may be a little slower to condemn others for falling short as well. And so there are times where I think it's just good to kind of run what you're about to say through the grid of, am I saying this out of humility or out of pride? Yeah. And if I'm truly humble people can still recognize error. Yeah. They can still recognize when there's something that's not right or true. But if you do it out of humility, it's not nearly as offensive. And if you ever try to correct someone out of pride, it doesn't usually go very well. No. If you humbly approach someone and out of humility seek to help them see perhaps where they could have done something better, it's received much better. And so I think it might do wonders for people that have developed a critical spirit to go back to that place of humility first and make sure that whatever is coming out of your mouth is done out of a Christ-like spirit, out of humility. And again, if you can genuinely do that, and there's times where I've been getting ready to post something, maybe something I really feel strongly about, or maybe I'm sending an email to someone about something, and then before you post it, before you send it, I've had to read back through and ask myself, does this come across condescendingly? Does this come across pridefully? And maybe I can still say this, but I need to reword it. I need to word it in a way where it's not about, look how smart I am, but no, here's a truth I just want to make sure we don't lose sight of here. Yeah. And sometimes you don't even have to point out what's wrong. You can just kind of subtly remind people of what's right. And so I think that this is not rocket science, and it's not that people are not noticing this. I think there's a lot of folks getting weary of the critical spirit that is being highlighted, especially in social media these days, and to say, is there a way perhaps to even address things that really need addressing, but to do it out of humility and Christ-likeness and grace? I think perhaps instead of polarizing people, we might actually come together more if we find to do it God's way instead of the world's way. And so again, I think we are in a kind of a negative, critical culture these days. And as Christians, I think we need to go to a higher level, not be just like everybody else. Again, it doesn't mean you don't speak truth, but there's a way to speak truth in love that does not just alienate people and cause you to lose relationships in the process.
Yeah, well, Richard, that's not how I would have put it. But we're out of time.
But who knows better?
Exactly. And on that note, we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.